Hello, my name is Bill Coughlin, and welcome to First Person Civil War Podcast, which retells the stories of the soldiers and officers on the ground in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 20 is entitled Private John B. Ernul of the 1st North Carolina Artillery at Point Lookout Prison Camp, and relies on his booklet, Life of a Confederate Soldier in a Federal Prison, which he published in 1914. John B. Ernul lived in Craven County, North Carolina, before the war began, and in April of 1861, just 1 month before his 18th birthday, and after receiving the permission of his parents, he enlisted as a private in Company I, 10th North Carolina State Troops, which eventually reflagged to the 1st North Carolina Artillery. Of the 10 companies in the 1st North Carolina Artillery, 4, including Company I, remained in their home state. Private Ernul did see action during the Civil War, but he remained true to the title of the booklet. On the 14th of March, 1862, I got my first experience in real war. But as I am writing mainly of my life in prison camp, Point Lookout, and how I was captured by a Yankee, I'll go back to March 7, 1865. Although it is not stated exactly which battle of 1862 it was, one can deduce that this was the Battle of New Bern, fought on the exact day mentioned by Private Ernul. By early March 1865, Confederate forces in North Carolina had to contest with 2 separate Union formations advancing deeper into the state. Sherman's army, having completed its march through South Carolina, entered North Carolina and began marching toward Fayetteville. Major General Schofield's men, who had just taken Wilmington in late February, marched towards Goldsboro, with the purpose of linking up with Sherman. Private Ernul and Company I, as part of the Department of North Carolina, marched to contest the Union advance from Wilmington. It was reported that Schofield's Army Corps, in reality a force commanded by Major General Cox, was advancing. We marched to a creek to investigate, and found the enemy in full view. They shelled us pretty lively all that evening, but made no attempt to charge. Our commanding officer decided that we had better get in their rear, so we started to the rear of the Yanks about an hour before day to play tag with them for a spell. We found them about sunrise, and we received them right warmly. After much tagging on both sides, the Yanks gave way, and we captured some 2,000 or 3,000 of them. Though Private Ernul does not give a location, he just described the Battle of Wyse Fork, specifically the flanking movement on March 8 on the southern end of the battlefield. This also means his estimate of captured Union soldiers is a bit inaccurate. Private Ernul's use of the term tag to describe fighting was surprising, for it was a deadly form of tag. That night, Private Ernul was captured. I was wounded in my leg, and seeing a pool of water, I thought I would bathe my leg and stop the blood. While busily engaged with my work, up poked a Yank and said, "Johnny, you are mine. Come with me, and I will take you to a summer resort. We have room enough for you all." He was brought to an unidentified general and continues. He asked me many questions concerning the troops in his rear. Then he asked if my leg was painful, called a doctor who examined my wound, and said there were small pieces of bone in the wound which made amputation necessary. Private Ernul does not remark any more about his leg, so it is assumed that it was able to heal. He stayed along the North Carolina coast within Union lines for an unidentified amount of time, and eventually boarded a ship to travel north. There were about 800 of us prisoners. After we had gotten out to sea, they began to issue rations of raw pickled beef and hardtack to us, which we all ate heartily. The sea was awfully rough. The waves were rolling high, and soon it was very evident that almost every prisoner was suffering dreadfully with sickness. After several days, we arrived at our summer resort. Private Ernul had arrived at Point Lookout, Maryland. It is the southernmost tip of land where the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay meet. Though it had a prison camp that housed Confederate soldiers and officers separately, adjacent to it was a wharf, post office, hospital, bakery, hotel, commissary, lighthouse, barracks for several Union regiments, Spaulding's photograph gallery, and several other buildings that turned Point Lookout into a small city. Private Ernul was in process and marched to the prison camp. We were taken from the barge to the headquarters of the officers' families. I saw some of the ladies pointing at us and remarking, I suppose, about our appearances. Some of us were barefooted, others without hats, while our pants were worn off on the knees. We were required to give our names and commands, name of states which we came, after which we were marched to the bullpen. This in-processing, while at face value, was to keep proper records of who was in the camp, but it seems authorities across the United States were aware of when new prisoners were admitted. There was at least one cold case reopened with the admittance of a Confederate soldier around the same time as Private Ernul. Brigadier General Stevenson, commander at Harper's Ferry, wrote to Edwin M. Stanton, U.S. Secretary of War, in mid-March 1865. There is at Point Lookout a rebel prisoner by the name of Frank Burnaugh, who previous to his entering the rebel army committed a most wanton murder of an Irishman who declared his purpose to fight for the Union. Can he be detained and tried for this murder? After in-processing, Private Ernul entered the prison camp. We got to the gate. It was thrown open, and we marched in. Things were looking bad to me. The prisoners were placed in tents from 8 to 10 to the tent, with no bedding but our clothes. The next morning, we drew meat. I thought at the time it was rather small for a meal, but found out it was to last all day. At 10 o'clock, we drew 1/2 loaf of bread and 1 pint of soup. As we were all sick, the rations did very well for a while. On Saturday, each man drew a loaf of bread to last until Monday. In his first few days at the prison, Private Ernul quickly learned that thievery of food prevailed within the camp. No matter how carefully he hid food to eat later, he found it gone when he decided to finally eat it. I feel sure that my bread was not stolen by a Confederate, for they did not steal. One might have borrowed it, and though I felt hard towards whoever got it then, I have forgiven him since, if he were a Confederate and only borrowed it. After the first Sunday, I hid no more bread, but put it where friends could not borrow it, nor thieves could steal it. I spent Sundays in fasting and prayer. Lack of food drove Private Ernul and others in the prison camp to resort to eating anything they could get their hands on. Just as a warning to the listener, some of the descriptions are unpleasant. After I had been in the prison for a few days, I began to suffer from hunger. I saw some of the boys eating broiled rats. They smelled very appetizing, but I could not get any to eat. I decided that I either must find something to eat or starve. On looking about, I saw some oats or rye growing beyond the dead line. I waited until dark to venture out for some of the grain. I thought I could make a soup of the grain. I got a turn of it, came back, and put it on to boil. The longer it boiled, the tougher it became, and the less fit it was to eat. So I gave up trying to find more to eat than my captors pleased to give me. Though prisoners, the Confederates at the prison camp had a degree of free rein at Point Lookout during the day. One day at the camp, Private Ernul recalls after walking through the hospital and past the dead house, known today as a morgue. Now I am coming to the toughest thing I had ever struck. After leaving the dead house, I came to the guard, meaning the guard building just outside of the camp. He told me to halt. I told him that I belonged on the other side and must go. He called over a white man who came and talked to me a while, and then he said, "You need some jewelry, something like a 12-pound ball and chain." Oh, horror of horrors! But my pleadings were all in vain. I sat down and received the jewelry. I sat there for a while thinking. I can't express how badly I felt. Can't remember a time when I felt worse. Private Ernul entered the camp with the jewelry and immediately went to his tent. He was not alone being fitted with this jewelry, and it seemed to be at random. Luckily for Private Ernul, there was another prisoner in camp with a file, and he could remove the jewelry. I found him, and had soon concluded a bargain. The gate on the bay, meaning the prison, stayed open during the daytime. Anyone noticing would have seen me going toward the end of the wharf, carrying my haversack. But only one person knew what it contained. That ball and chain is now resting at the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay. Point Lookout was not a permanent prison facility for any one soldier. On 9 February 1865, for example, the wharf welcomed flag of truce boats to take newly paroled men back south. By Private Ernul's own account, the ball and chain was no isolated incident. An exchanged Confederate soldiers informed Confederate officials such as R.O. Old, agent of exchange, who wrote to his Union counterpart, Lieutenant Colonel John E. Mulford, assistant agent of exchange, on 15 February 1865, to halt such treatment. I am informed by returned prisoners from Point Lookout that Private Gorman of General Lee's Scouts is confined with ball and chain at that place. Why is this done? It is not contested that he is a regular Confederate soldier. Cannot this sort of treatment of soldiers be permanently prevented? I will thank you to return this man under our agreement. The War of the Rebellion source material does not have any replies by Lieutenant Colonel Mulford on the topic, but Mr. Old did write enough letters that even Edwin M. Stanton corresponded with Brigadier General Hoffman, Commissioner General of Prisoners, on 25 May 1865, on use of the ball and chain. On the 20th of March, a letter from Mr. Old complaining that Colonel Wilson and other rebel officers were wearing ball and chain at Alton, which was in Illinois, was received from Lieutenant General Grant with directions that if the facts were as reported, the officers should be forwarded for exchange. On receipt of this letter, I informed the Lieutenant General by telegram, March 25, that the officers referred to were not then and had not been wearing ball and chain, but that they were under sentence to confinement for various periods. By June of 1865, as Confederate commands across the South continued to surrender, release of prisoners accelerated. Private Ernul, still at Point Lookout prisoner of war camp, would soon be released. On the 11th of June, 1865, a notice was put out on the bulletin board that all the prisoners were to be discharged. This notice brought forth the most joyous yells I had heard in months. About 20,000 men and boys made a rush for the gate. Each man gave his name, company, regiment, and state, then received his discharge. My name happened to be among the first called. I think I smiled for the first time in months, took the oath, and received my parole, which I still have. Though it does not include most of January through June, a report on 9 January 1865 details the death rate at Point Lookout, which was the largest POW camp since its creation in July 1863. A report as to the number of deaths among the prisoners has been called for from the 3 largest camps. Point Lookout, Maryland, since July 31st, 1863, number of prisoners, 32,140, number of deaths, 1,532. 4.7% of POWs that entered Point Lookout died, compared to Sandusky City, which was an officer camp, 2.6%, and Fort Delaware's 8.6%. John B. Ernul returned to North Carolina, where he served as a ward in New Bern. In 1914, he wrote Life of a Confederate Soldier in a Federal Prison. As many of the veterans had already died, he opened his book. As the greater number of the boys of 61 and 65 who donned the gray and fought for the right as they saw the right have passed over the mysterious river Styx and are at rest under the shade of the tree of life, and those who still remain must soon follow, I have decided to write a sketch of my life as a Confederate soldier. Thank you for listening to the 20th episode. The link to Private Ernul's book is now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a detailed drawing of Point Lookout, Maryland, and a picture entitled Johnny Reb, an unidentified soldier at Point Lookout Prisoner of War Camp. In the show notes, you will find a link to a more detailed file of the drawing of Point Lookout, Maryland, on the Library of Congress's website that allows zooming in for detail, and a description of most buildings at the bottom. The prison camp is the walled-off section in the top right corner of the drawing. First Sergeant Thomas B. Marshall of Company K, 83rd Ohio, provides next week's first-person account at the Siege of Vicksburg. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.